Service workers used the back entrance, sweetheart, and next time try not to drip on my Italian leather shoes. Those were the first words Richard Blackwood spoke to his own boss, though he didn't know it yet. In exactly 37 minutes, that single sentence would cost him everything he'd spent 15 years building at Aurora Aviation. But right now, all he saw was a soggy Asian woman in a practical coat standing in his pristine hangar, and he was annoyed. The November rain at Teterboro Airport wasn't just falling that Tuesday afternoon. It was attacking the earth with the kind of vicious persistence that only New Jersey weather could muster. Each drop seemed personally offended by the existence of anything dry, and the wind carried that bitter smell of jet fuel mixed with wet asphalt that made your nose burn if you breathed too deeply. Diana Chen pulled her beige trench coat tighter around her neck as she approached Hangar 23, checking the vintage Patek Philippe watch hidden beneath her sleeve. 2:14 p.m. She was 4 minutes early, which was exactly how she planned it. Diana was the kind of woman who planned everything from her morning coffee temperature to hostile corporate takeovers, and right now she was executing the most important inspection of her career. 3 weeks ago, her private equity firm, Phoenix Holdings, had quietly acquired Aurora Aviation through a web of shell companies and legal intermediaries so complex that even the Aurora employees didn't know who actually signed their paychecks now. The paperwork simply said D. Chen, and in an industry dominated by men, everyone had naturally assumed the D stood for David or Daniel or Derek. Some generic powerful man in an expensive suit who would show up eventually to either fire them all or pat them on the head and tell them to keep doing whatever they'd been doing. They were half right about the expensive suit part, but they'd gotten everything else catastrophically wrong. Diana had built Phoenix Holdings from absolutely nothing, starting with a $2,000 laptop in her grandmother's restaurant kitchen in Flushing, Queens, while the old woman served dumplings to late-night workers and whispered stories about dignity and respect in a mixture of Korean and broken English. Those stories had shaped Diana's understanding of power, not the kind that shouted and demanded attention, but the quiet kind that observed and planned and struck only when the moment was perfect. Her grandmother had taught her that respect wasn't something you begged for, it was something you commanded through excellence, and Diana had spent 20 years proving that lesson in boardrooms, from Manhattan to Seoul. The acquisition of Aurora Aviation wasn't just business, though the $4 billion company certainly fit nicely into Phoenix Holdings' aerospace portfolio. This was personal. Diana had been hearing whispers for months about the toxic culture at Aurora, stories from industry contacts about discrimination, harassment, and management that treated employees like disposable equipment rather than human beings. When the opportunity came to buy them out from under their current ownership, Diana hadn't hesitated, but she also hadn't announced herself immediately. She wanted to see the truth first, to understand exactly what kind of rot had taken hold in the company before she decided whether to fix it or simply burn it all down and start over. That's why she was standing in the freezing rain outside Hangar 23, looking like any other middle management executive coming in from the cold rather than sitting in a heated limousine being escorted through the front entrance with champagne and fake smiles. Diana needed to see how Aurora Aviation treated people when they thought nobody important was watching, because in her experience, that's when you learned who people really were underneath all their professional politeness. The hangar doors were open, spilling warm halogen light across the wet tarmac like liquid gold, and inside she could see the object of Aurora's pride, a gleaming Gulfstream G700 worth more than most people's houses. The $75 million aircraft was beautiful in the way that only perfect engineering could be, all smooth curves and polished aluminum that reflected the overhead lights like a mirror. Standing near the boarding stairs, she could see 3 people in expensive suits, the kind of people who looked like they belonged next to $75 million airplanes. Diana approached the hangar entrance, stepping just inside the threshold to escape the rain that was beginning to soak through her coat despite its designer pedigree. She could feel the water starting to frizz her carefully styled black hair, and her sensible flats were already squelching with each step across the concrete floor. but she kept her expression calm and professional as she prepared to introduce herself to the Aurora management team. What she didn't expect was for the tallest of the three, a man with the kind of aristocratic bone structure that screamed old money and Ivy League privilege, to look her up and down like she was something unpleasant he'd found on the bottom of his shoe before delivering that opening line about service workers and back entrances. Richard Blackwood, though, Diana didn't know his name yet, was holding a crystal tumbler filled with what looked like expensive whiskey, and his voice carried that particular blend of boredom and contempt that only came from a lifetime of never being told no. Diana felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the November weather, a familiar sensation she'd experienced countless times before in business school classrooms and corporate boardrooms where people made assumptions about her capabilities based on her gender and ethnicity. She'd learned long ago that the first few minutes of any interaction were crucial, that people would form opinions about her worth and intelligence before she even had a chance to speak, and those opinions would color everything that came afterward. Right now, looking at Richard Blackwood's sneer and the way his companions were already dismissing her presence, Diana made a decision that would change all their lives forever. She could reveal herself immediately, show them her identification, and watch them scramble to apologize and recover, but that wouldn't tell her what she needed to know about Aurora Aviation's culture. Instead, she was going to let them show her exactly who they were when they thought they had power over someone they considered beneath them. Diana reached into her coat pocket and touched the worn photograph she always carried, a picture of her grandmother standing proudly in front of their family restaurant, wearing the kind of dignity that couldn't be bought or inherited but had to be earned through years of quiet strength. The old woman had survived war and poverty, and discrimination had built something beautiful from nothing, and had taught Diana that true power wasn't about making other people feel small. It was about lifting them up while you climbed higher yourself. "I'm looking for the management team," Diana said quietly, her voice steady despite the cold rain still dripping from her hair. "I have a meeting scheduled regarding the transition." The response she got would teach her everything she needed to know about Aurora Aviation, and it would teach Richard Blackwood something about assumptions and consequences that his Ivy League education had somehow failed to cover. Richard Blackwood's theatrical sigh shook his shoulders as he turned back to face Diana, stepping closer in that particular way powerful men had of using their physical presence to intimidate. He was tall, probably 6'3" in his handmade Italian shoes, with the kind of face that had never known a day of genuine hardship, and when he spoke, his voice carried the smooth arrogance of someone who'd grown up believing the world existed to serve his convenience. "Look," Richard said, swirling his whiskey in a way that made the ice cubes clink against the crystal like tiny bells. "We are currently preparing for the arrival of the new ownership representative, and we don't have time for whatever this is supposed to be. Are you from the temp agency? Because if you're looking for the stewardess replacement position, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time." Diana felt that familiar fire starting to build in her chest, the same heat she'd felt in countless conference rooms where men had talked over her or around her or through her as if she were invisible, but she kept her expression neutral and her voice calm. "I am not from a temp agency. I am Chen, and I believe you're expecting me." The silence that followed was broken by Trevor Hartley's sharp bark of laughter, the kind of sound that was designed to humiliate rather than express any genuine amusement. Trevor was younger than Richard, maybe 35, with the desperate, hungry look of someone clawing his way up a corporate ladder that never seemed to get any shorter. His suit was expensive, but not quite expensive enough. His watch was flashy, but not quite the right brand, and everything about him screamed new money trying desperately to look like old money. "You're Chen," Trevor said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that made Diana's jaw tighten involuntarily. "Right. And I'm the Queen of England. Listen, lady, I don't know what kind of game you're trying to play here, but lying to get in the door is pathetic, even by temp worker standards." The actual D. Chen is a serious business person, someone with real credentials and real money, not someone who looks like they just stepped off the bus from wherever you people come from. The casual racism in that last phrase hung in the air like smoke, and Diana felt something shift inside her chest, a cold, calculating fury that she'd learned to harness and control over years of dealing with people who thought her heritage made her somehow less American, less qualified, less worthy of respect. She'd heard variations of this conversation 1,000 times before from Harvard Business School classmates who asked where she was really from to corporate executives who complimented her English and seemed surprised when she told them she'd been born in Manhattan. Trevor came a softer voice from behind them, and Diana turned to see a woman approaching with a tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. This was Jennifer Walsh, the HR director, and she looked uncomfortable in a way that suggested she recognized that this conversation was heading somewhere dangerous, but she wasn't quite brave enough to stop it. Jennifer was in her early 40s with the kind of carefully controlled appearance that spoke to years of walking the tightrope between professionalism and femininity in a male-dominated industry, and when she spoke, her voice carried a nervous energy that made Diana think of prey animals, sensing predators nearby. "Maybe we should check her identification," Jennifer suggested, though her tone was hesitant, as if she was afraid of being shut down for the suggestion. "Company policy requires us to verify all visitors, and if she says she has a meeting—" "Company policy," Richard interrupted his voice, taking on a mocking tone that made Jennifer flinch visibly, "is to maintain security and prevent unauthorized personnel from accessing sensitive areas. And company policy also says we don't waste time on obvious frauds just because they show up claiming to be someone important. The real D. Chen is a man, Jennifer, a serious businessman with serious credentials, not some random woman who wandered in from the rain looking for a handout." Diana watched this interaction with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for hostile negotiations, noting the power dynamics at play. The way Jennifer immediately deferred to Richard's authority, despite her obvious discomfort. The way Trevor seemed to feed off Richard's approval like a parasite drawing energy from its host. She was seeing Aurora Aviation's corporate culture in real time, watching how decisions were made and how dissent was handled, and what she saw made her stomach turn with a combination of disgust and determination. So Jennifer tried again, her voice even smaller this time. "Maybe we should call security to escort her out if you don't think she belongs here. They could verify her identity and handle any necessary paperwork." "No need for security," Richard said, waving his hand dismissively while taking another sip of his whiskey, as if the expensive alcohol could wash away the inconvenience of Diana's presence. "She's leaving right now voluntarily because she understands that this is a place for serious people conducting serious business, not a shelter for people who got lost looking for the unemployment office." He pointed a manicured finger toward the tarmac, where the rain was still coming down in sheets that turned the world into a gray blur of motion and noise. "Outside. You're tracking water on my floor, and frankly, your presence is making our guests uncomfortable. The actual D. Chen will be here shortly, and when a real business leader arrives, we don't want them to think Aurora Aviation is the kind of company that lets random people wander around our secure facilities." Diana looked down at the floor beneath her feet, noting that it was concrete, the kind of industrial surface designed to handle oil spills and heavy equipment, not the precious hardwood that Richard was pretending she was somehow defiling with her presence. When she looked back up, she found 3 pairs of eyes staring at her with varying degrees of hostility and impatience, and she realized that this was a test of sorts, a moment that would define not just how they saw her, but how they saw themselves and their place in the world. "You want me to wait outside," Diana said. And it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that carried no emotion whatsoever, which somehow made it more unsettling than if she'd shouted or argued or shown any visible reaction to their treatment. "Unless you want me to call the police for trespassing," Richard replied, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Your choice is simple. Walk out that door under your own power or get escorted out in handcuffs. Either way, you're not staying in my hangar contaminating the air while real business people try to work." Diana stared at him for exactly 3 seconds, memorizing the smugness in his expression, the way Trevor was checking his phone with bored indifference to her humiliation, the way Jennifer was studying the floor to avoid making eye contact with what was happening right in front of her. She was cataloging everything, storing it all away for later, because she had learned long ago that the people who were cruel when they thought they had power over you would always show you exactly who they really were if you gave them enough rope. "Fine," Diana said softly, her voice carrying no anger or hurt or frustration. Just a strange calm that made Richard's eyebrows draw together in confusion. "I'll wait outside." And as she turned toward the hangar entrance toward the freezing rain and the November wind, Diana was already planning exactly how she was going to destroy them. The rain had intensified while Diana stood inside the hangar being systematically humiliated, and now it attacked her with the kind of vicious determination that soaked through even the most expensive fabric within seconds. She found minimal shelter under the small overhang of the security shack about 50 yards from the hangar entrance, a pathetic excuse for cover that barely protected her from the worst of the downpour while still allowing the wind to whip moisture directly into her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup and chilling her to the bone. Diana took out her phone, grateful for the waterproof case that had seemed like overprotective paranoia when she'd bought it, but now felt like a lifeline to her real world, the world where she was Diana Chen, CEO and founder of Phoenix Holdings, not some random woman being treated like garbage by men who wouldn't last 5 minutes in her actual boardroom. Her fingers were already getting numb from the cold, making it difficult to type, but she managed to pull up the contact list and find the number she needed. Captain Morrison, came the warm voice of James Morrison, Aurora Aviation's chief pilot, and one of the few people at the company who'd actually worked with Diana during the acquisition process, though even he didn't know she was the actual owner, rather than just another corporate representative. "I thought you were coming aboard. We're prepping for the demo flight to Miami, and everything's looking good for departure in about 20 minutes. I'm here, James," Diana said, her voice shaking slightly from the cold that was seeping through her expensive coat like it was made of tissue paper. "I'm standing outside the hangar in the rain because your management team just kicked me out. They think I'm a temp worker, and they refuse to check my identification or verify my appointment." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Diana wondered if the call had dropped, but then she heard Captain Morrison's low growl of anger, the kind of sound that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully to avoid saying something that would get him fired or arrested. "They did what Miss Chen. It's 40 degrees and pouring rain out there. I'm coming to get you right now with an umbrella, and then I'm going to have some very serious words with Mr. Blackwood about basic human decency. No." Diana ordered, her voice taking on the steel that had closed billion-dollar mergers and convinced entire boards of directors to bet their companies on her vision. "If you come out there, they'll know I have authority here, and I need to see how they behave when they think no one important is watching. I need to understand exactly how deep this rot goes before I decide what to do about it." Diana wiped rain from her face with the back of her hand, feeling her carefully styled hair beginning to curl and frizz in the humidity, but her mind was crystal clear now, focused with the kind of laser intensity that had made her one of the most feared corporate raiders in the aerospace industry. "James, is the cabin audio system operational? Can you monitor what they're saying when they think they're alone?" "Yes, ma'am," Captain Morrison replied, his voice tight with barely controlled anger at what was happening to her. "I have the cabin microphone system routed to my headset for safety monitoring during passenger briefings. I can record everything they say, but Miss Chen, you shouldn't have to endure this treatment just to gather intelligence on your own employees. Tell them," Diana continued, ignoring his protest because she'd learned long ago that justice was worth a little temporary suffering, "that the catering staff has been cleared to load the galley for the demonstration flight. Tell them that Chen has been delayed by traffic, but insists that the flight proceed with just the management team so they can evaluate service standards without interference from the new ownership. Captain Morrison was quiet for a moment, processing what she was asking him to do. Understanding without her having to explain that she was planning something that would either be brilliantly strategic or spectacularly dangerous. You want to serve them drinks while they think you're invisible. Miss Chen, are you sure about this? These people have already shown they're willing to humiliate you. If they figure out who you really are while you're in a confined space with them, they won't figure it out, Diana said with absolute certainty, reaching into her large leather tote bag and pulling out the generic black apron she'd brought originally to protect her clothes if she decided to inspect the engine housing personally. Men like Richard Blackwood don't see service workers as actual human beings. I'll be invisible to them, which means I'll hear exactly what they really think about the new ownership about the company and about how they plan to handle the transition. She tied the apron around her waist, covering her tailored blazer and the expensive Patek Philippe watch that would immediately give away her real status if anyone bothered to look closely enough. The transformation was remarkable, how a simple piece of black fabric could change her from corporate executive to anonymous service worker in the minds of people who had already decided what category she belonged in based on her appearance and their own assumptions. The security shack provided just enough shelter for Diana to change her entire approach to this situation, shifting from victim to hunter in the space of a phone call. She thought about her grandmother, who had cleaned office buildings at night to pay for Diana's education, who had taught her that there was dignity in all honest work, but also that people revealed their true character by how they treated those they perceived as powerless. Today, she was going to see Richard Blackwood and his team's true character, and she was going to make sure they never forgot the lesson. James, Diana said, her voice now carrying the calm certainty of someone who had just figured out exactly how to win a game her opponents didn't even know they were playing. I'm coming back in through the service entrance. Maintain radio silence about who I really am, but make sure every word they say is recorded. By the time we land in Miami, I want enough evidence to bury them so deep they'll never see sunlight again. She hung up the phone and stood for a moment in the rain, letting the cold soak into her bones, letting the humiliation crystallize into something harder and more dangerous than simple anger. Richard Blackwood had wanted her to wait outside like some kind of unwanted animal had treated her with casual cruelty because he thought she was powerless to fight back. In exactly 90 minutes, he was going to learn that the most dangerous predators were the ones that looked like prey, and Diana Chen had been hunting men like him her entire career. She pulled the apron tighter around her waist, lowered her head in false submission, and walked back through the rain toward the hangar where Richard Blackwood was about to make the biggest mistake of his professional life. The rain continued to fall, but Diana wasn't cold anymore. She was burning with purpose. Diana's return to the hangar was a masterclass in invisible transformation, the way she changed her entire posture and demeanor to become exactly what Richard Blackwood expected to see when he looked at someone in a service apron. She kept her eyes downcast, her shoulders slightly hunched, her movements careful and apologetic, as she approached the group that was now settled comfortably in the luxury seating area near the aircraft, their earlier cruelty apparently forgotten as quickly as yesterday's weather. "Excuse me," Diana said. Her voice pitched higher and softer than her natural tone, carrying just the right amount of nervousness to suggest someone who was afraid of being yelled at again. The pilot said I could load the galley for the flight service. There was a mix-up with the regular catering staff, and my agency sent me to cover the route. Richard looked up from his conversation with Trevor about quarterly projections, his expression showing mild annoyance that someone was interrupting his important discussion to ask permission for something as mundane as loading beverages. He studied Diana's appearance, taking in the generic black apron, the slightly damp hair that she'd deliberately left disheveled, the submissive posture that suggested someone who knew her place in the world and wasn't planning to step out of it anytime soon. Finally, someone who understands the chain of command. Richard said, his voice carrying that particular blend of satisfaction and contempt that came from having his authority acknowledged by someone he considered beneath his notice. Load that crate of Dom Perignon onto the aircraft and try not to break anything. Each bottle costs more than you probably make in a week, so handle everything like your job depends on it, because it absolutely does. Diana lifted the heavy wooden crate that contained 6 bottles of champagne worth more than most people's monthly rent. Feeling the weight strain her arms in a way that her regular fitness routine hadn't quite prepared her for, but she gritted her teeth and carried it up the stairs to the Gulfstream's cabin without complaint. The physical labor was nothing compared to the emotional weight of being treated like a piece of equipment rather than a human being, but she used that anger as fuel, storing it away for later when she would need it most. Inside the aircraft, the luxury was almost overwhelming cream-colored leather seats that probably cost more than a car-polished wood trim that gleamed under the soft cabin lighting, and enough space for 12 passengers to travel in comfort that most people couldn't even imagine. Diana moved efficiently through the galley, stocking the refrigerator with champagne and caviar, arranging crystal glasses and gold-trimmed plates. Her hands steady despite the fury building in her chest as she listened to Richard, Trevor, and Jennifer settling into their seats and beginning to talk as if she weren't even there. So Jennifer was saying, her voice carrying that nervous energy that suggested she was trying to make conversation to fill an uncomfortable silence. "What's your read on this new ownership situation? Do you think they're planning major changes, or are they going to let us keep running things the way we have been?" Trevor's laugh was sharp and confident, the sound of someone who believed he had everything figured out, even when he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Jennifer, you worry too much about things that are completely outside your control. The new owner is just another finance guy who bought Aurora because the numbers looked good on a spreadsheet. He'll probably show up once or twice a year to glad hand with the important clients, but day-to-day operations will stay exactly the same, because guys like Chen don't know the first thing about actually running an aviation company." Diana felt her jaw clench involuntarily as she arranged the service items on the galley counter, her movements becoming slightly more forceful than necessary as she processed the casual dismissal of her expertise and capabilities. These people had no idea that she'd built Phoenix Holdings specifically by acquiring underperforming aerospace companies and turning them into industry leaders through a combination of operational efficiency and cultural transformation. But their ignorance was about to become their downfall. The engines began to spool up with that distinctive whine that meant serious power was being generated, and Diana felt the familiar sensation of an aircraft preparing for takeoff, the subtle vibrations through the floor that spoke to millions of dollars of engineering working in perfect harmony. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom, professional and calm, announcing that they were cleared for departure and that the flight to Miami would take approximately 90 minutes once they reached cruising altitude. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Morrison continued, his voice carrying just the slightest edge that suggested he knew exactly what was happening in his cabin and wasn't particularly happy about it. "Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and prepare for departure. Our flight attendant will begin beverage service once we've reached cruising altitude." Diana almost smiled at that last comment, understanding that James was giving her official cover for what she was about to do, legitimizing her presence in the cabin as part of the normal flight service rather than corporate espionage. The Gulfstream began to taxi toward the runway, the movement smooth and powerful as $75 million worth of aviation technology carried them away from Teterboro and toward whatever consequences awaited at 37,000 feet. As they lifted off into the storm clouds, Diana could see the hangar falling away below them, becoming smaller and smaller, until it was just another building in the industrial landscape of northern New Jersey. But she knew that what happened in the next 90 minutes would determine whether that hangar would still belong to Aurora Aviation, or become the first property seized in a federal investigation that would destroy everyone currently laughing and joking in the cabin behind her. The aircraft climbed steadily through the gray soup of the storm turbulence, shaking the cabin in irregular rhythms that made the champagne bottles clink softly against each other in the refrigerator. But Diana was focused entirely on the conversation happening just a few feet away, where Richard Blackwood was about to reveal exactly how corrupt Aurora Aviation had become under his leadership. She arranged the service items with careful precision, every movement calculated to keep her invisible, while positioning herself to hear every word that would soon condemn them all. The plane broke through the storm clouds into brilliant sunshine that transformed the world below into an ocean of white cotton, beautiful and peaceful in a way that seemed to mock the ugly reality of what was happening inside the cabin. Diana took a deep breath, centering herself for what was coming next, because she knew that in the rarefied air of cruising altitude, people often said things they would never dare speak on the ground, as if the physical distance from consequences somehow made them immune to judgment. Richard Blackwood was about to discover that distance was just an illusion, and that some consequences followed you no matter how high you climbed. At 37,000 feet, something happened to people like Richard Blackwood that Diana had observed countless times in her corporate career. A kind of altitude-induced confidence that made them believe they were literally above the consequences of their actions. The expensive whiskey certainly didn't hurt either, and as the Gulf Stream leveled off into smooth air above the storm clouds, the three Aurora executives settled into their leather seats, with the kind of relaxed arrogance that came from believing they were in a private space where they could speak freely about things they'd never dare discuss in a boardroom or office building. Diana moved quietly through the cabin, refilling their drinks and arranging fresh napkins with the invisible efficiency that service workers developed to survive in environments where their presence was simultaneously essential and unwanted. She'd perfected this particular skill during her summers working in her grandmother's restaurant, learning how to anticipate needs while remaining completely unnoticed by customers who preferred to pretend they were being served by magic rather than actual human beings with eyes and ears and perfectly functional brains. "You know what I love about this job," Richard was saying, his voice looser now that he'd finished his third whiskey and was working on his fourth, the alcohol stripping away whatever professional filters he might have possessed under normal circumstances. "It's not just the money, though. Obviously, the money is fantastic. It's the fact that we get to play with other people's toys while they're not watching." Trevor leaned forward in his seat, his expression eager in the way that suggested he was finally getting to hear the real truth about how Aurora Aviation operated the behind-the-scenes information that would help him understand how to position himself for maximum personal benefit. "What do you mean by that?" "Are you talking about the aircraft themselves, or something else?" "I'm talking about everything," Richard replied, gesturing broadly with his crystal tumbler in a way that made the expensive whiskey slosh dangerously close to the rim. "The planes, the contracts, the federal oversight committees that are supposed to be monitoring our maintenance standards, all of it. Trevor, you've been here, 2 years? Have you ever actually looked at the real numbers behind our maintenance budget? Not the sanitized reports we send to corporate, but the actual cash flow." Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face taking on the kind of pale, pinched expression that suggested she knew exactly where this conversation was heading and wasn't particularly enthusiastic about being included in it. "Richard, maybe we shouldn't be discussing internal financial matters in front of—" She glanced toward Diana, who was carefully polishing champagne flutes at the galley counter. "External personnel." "External personnel," Richard laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive as he waved his hand toward Diana as if she were a piece of furniture rather than a human being with functioning ears. "Jennifer's service staff aren't people, they're part of the equipment. She's no more capable of understanding what we're talking about than the coffee machine is, and even if she could process the words we're saying, which I seriously doubt, who would she tell? Her supervisor at whatever temp agency sent her. Please." Diana's grip tightened on the champagne flute she was holding, and she had to consciously force herself to relax her fingers before the delicate crystal shattered in her hand, sending sharp fragments across the galley counter and revealing the strength of her emotional reaction to Richard's casual dehumanization. She continued her movements with mechanical precision, but every word he spoke was being recorded in her perfect memory for later use, every casual cruelty catalogued for the reckoning that was coming whether he knew it or not. The maintenance budget. Richard continued settling back into his seat with the satisfied expression of someone about to share a particularly clever secret, is our personal piggy bank. And the beautiful thing is that the new ownership will never figure it out because finance guys like Diana Chen only look at the bottom line, not the individual line items that create it. Trevor's eyes lit up with the kind of greedy interest that suggested he was already calculating his potential share of whatever Richard was about to reveal. How does that work exactly? I mean, maintenance is pretty heavily regulated by the FAA, isn't it? There are inspection requirements and documentation standards that are supposed to prevent exactly that kind of creative accounting. Trevor, my naive friend, Richard said, his voice taking on the condescending tone of a professor. Lecturing a particularly slow student, regulations are only as effective as the people enforcing them, and enforcement is only as thorough as the documentation requires it to be. We have a shell company called Meridian Consultants incorporated in the Cayman Islands that provides aviation advisory services to Aurora Aviation, and 18% of our maintenance budget flows through that company as consulting fees for specialized technical guidance. Diana felt a cold shock of recognition at those numbers, because 18% of Aurora Aviation's annual maintenance budget would represent approximately $12 million in diverted funds. Money that was supposed to be keeping passengers safe at 40,000 feet, but was instead disappearing into offshore accounts. Her mental calculator was already running the projections for how much money had been stolen over the years Richard had been in charge, and the numbers were staggering enough to represent serious federal crimes with serious federal consequences. But what about the actual maintenance? Jennifer asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern that suggested she understood the life or death implications of what Richard was describing. I mean, these aircraft are carrying passengers, including us right now. If the maintenance budget is being diverted, how are we ensuring that the planes are actually safe to fly? Richard's smile was the kind that would have looked perfectly at home on a predator discussing prey, cold and calculating and utterly without conscience. Jennifer, you're thinking about this all wrong. The maintenance still gets done. It just gets done more efficiently. Instead of using overpriced union mechanics and genuine manufacturer parts, we use independent contractors and compatible components that do exactly the same job for a fraction of the cost. The difference between what we spend and what we bill goes through Meridian Consultants, and everyone wins. Except for the passengers who might die if those compatible components fail at the wrong moment, Jennifer said quietly, her voice barely audible over the constant hum of the aircraft's engines, but loud enough for Diana to hear every word with crystal clarity. Jennifer Richards' voice took on a dangerous edge, the kind of tone that suggested he was tired of having his decisions questioned by someone he considered intellectually inferior. You're being dramatically over-emotional about a simple business efficiency. These aircraft have multiple redundant safety systems, and the statistical probability of component failure resulting in passenger casualties is so low that it's essentially negligible. We're not talking about Russian roulette here. We're talking about smart resource allocation that maximizes shareholder value while maintaining acceptable risk parameters. Trevor nodded enthusiastically, his expression showing that he was already mentally spending his share of the stolen money. And the new ownership won't be able to figure out the arrangement because all they'll see is the bottom-line maintenance costs, which will look perfectly reasonable compared to industry standards. Even if they audit the books, Meridian Consultants is a legitimate consulting company with proper documentation for all services rendered. Exactly, Richard said, raising his glass in a mock toast to his own cleverness. To the new ownership, and may they be exactly as blind as they are rich. D. Chen is going to walk into Aurora Aviation, thinking he's bought a clean, efficient operation, and by the time he figures out how we've been managing things, we'll have vested our stock options and moved on to consulting positions with other companies who appreciate our particular talents. Diana set down the champagne flute she'd been holding and turned slightly toward the cabin, her movement casual enough to seem like normal service work, but positioned so she could see the expressions on their faces as they laughed and celebrated their theft from the company she owned. Richard's face was flushed with alcohol and self-satisfaction. Trevor looked like he'd just won the lottery, and Jennifer appeared to be struggling with some kind of internal conflict between her professional obligations and her personal conscience. The altitude was making them giddy. The isolated environment was making them careless, and the expensive alcohol was making them stupid. But Diana was stone-cold sober and recording every word for the federal investigators who would be very interested to learn about Meridian Consultants and the $12 million in diverted maintenance funds that were putting passenger lives at risk for the sake of executive bonuses. She picked up another champagne flute and began polishing it with mechanical precision, her movements steady and unremarkable, while her mind raced through the legal implications of what she'd just heard. Securities fraud, federal aviation safety violations, conspiracy to defraud, and probably a dozen other charges that would put these people in federal prison for the rest of their professional lives, assuming they survived the civil lawsuits that would follow when the families of potential crash victims learned how Aurora Aviation had been cutting corners on safety to fund offshore bank accounts. Richard Blackwood thought he was untouchable at 37,000 feet, insulated from consequences by altitude and arrogance and expensive whiskey. But he was about to learn that some predators preferred to hunt in thin air where their prey had nowhere to run. Diana set the crystal champagne flute down on the galley counter with deliberate precision, the soft clink of glass against marble creating a sound that seemed to echo through the cabin with unusual clarity, though none of the three executives paid it any attention because they were still celebrating their cleverness in stealing millions of dollars from their own company. She straightened slowly, her movement causing the cheap fabric of the service apron to pull against her shoulders in a way that suddenly felt constraining, like a costume she'd worn too long for a performance that was finally reaching its climax. Actually, Diana said, her voice cutting through their laughter with the kind of quiet authority that made conversations stop and heads turn instinctively toward the source. He isn't blind, and she isn't absent. The silence that followed was the kind of complete stillness that only happened in pressurized cabins at high altitude, where the absence of outside noise made every breath and heartbeat audible, where the hum of engines became a background symphony to whatever drama was unfolding in the passenger compartment. Richard lowered his whiskey glass slowly, his expression shifting from casual amusement to confused annoyance as his alcohol-softened brain tried to process why the service worker was speaking in complete sentences and why her voice sounded nothing like the nervous apologetic tone she'd used earlier. "Excuse me." Richard said his words carrying the kind of dangerous precision that powerful men used when they were about to remind someone of their place in the social hierarchy. "Did you just interrupt a private conversation? Because I'm fairly certain that when I'm paying for private aviation services, the help is supposed to remain invisible unless specifically addressed." Diana reached up and untied the black apron that had been her disguise for the past hour, letting it drop to the cabin floor, where it landed with the kind of soft finality that marked the end of one performance and the beginning of another. Underneath her tailored blazer was slightly wrinkled from the constraint but still unmistakably expensive cut with the kind of precision that only came from Savile Row tailors and careful attention to the details that separated real power from its imitators. "My name," Diana said, unbuttoning her coat to reveal the small but distinctive Phoenix Holdings pin on her lapel, the kind of corporate jewelry that meant nothing to most people but would be immediately recognizable to anyone who'd been following aerospace industry acquisitions over the past 5 years, "is Diana Chen, and I am the CEO and founder of Phoenix Holdings, which means I am the owner of Aurora Aviation, which means I am your boss." The color drained from Trevor's face so quickly that Diana wondered if the cabin pressure might be affecting his circulation. But she suspected it had more to do with the sudden realization that he'd just confessed to securities fraud in front of the one person on Earth who had both the authority and the motivation to prosecute him for it. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, like a fish pulled from water, and struggling to breathe in an environment that was suddenly hostile to its survival. Jennifer made a small choking sound that might have been an attempt at speech, or possibly just her body's involuntary response to the shock of understanding that the woman she'd watched being humiliated and forced to wait in the rain was actually the most powerful person at Aurora Aviation, someone whose single phone call could not only end her career, but destroy her professional reputation so thoroughly that she'd never work in corporate America again. But Richard Blackwood's reaction was the most interesting because instead of shock or fear or even anger, his face showed something that looked almost like relief, as if some part of his mind had been expecting this moment and was almost grateful that the waiting was finally over. He set his whiskey glass down on the armrest of his chair and looked directly at Diana for what felt like the first time since she'd walked into the hangar, really seeing her instead of just glancing past her towards something more important. "You're the woman from the hangar," Richard said slowly, his voice carrying a note of recognition that suggested his memory was finally connecting the nervous service worker with the confident executive standing before him now. "The woman I told to wait outside in the rain. The woman Trevor called a temp worker and a fraud. The woman you assumed was invisible?" Diana corrected her voice, carrying the kind of steel that came from years of hostile negotiations and corporate warfare. "The woman you thought was too stupid to understand basic English, let alone complex financial arrangements involving offshore shell companies and federal aviation safety violations." She pulled her tablet from the leather bag that Richard had dismissed as cheap and functional, tapping the screen with movements that were precise and confident, clearly someone who was completely comfortable with technology rather than intimidated by it. The large LCD monitors mounted throughout the cabin flickered and changed from the flight information display to show a live video feed of their conversation, complete with timestamp and audio quality, that would be admissible in federal court. "What the hell is this?" Trevor found his voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than the confident sales pitch tone he'd been using earlier, and he was looking around the cabin as if searching for hidden cameras or microphones that might explain how their private conversation had suddenly become a recorded deposition. This, Diana said, her finger moving across the tablet screen to open new windows that showed financial records, bank transfer logs, and what appeared to be a live connection to a secure video conference is a Gulfstream G700 owned by Phoenix Holdings, which means that everything that happens on this aircraft is subject to corporate monitoring and federal oversight. "Every word you've spoken in the last hour has been recorded and transmitted to our legal team, our federal compliance officers, and the FBI's white-collar crime division." She turned the tablet toward them so they could see the screen, which displayed a detailed breakdown of every financial transaction between Aurora Aviation and Meridian Consultants over the past 3 years, complete with dates, amounts, and what appeared to be copies of forged inspection reports that had been used to justify the payments. The numbers were staggering, representing not just millions of dollars in theft, but a pattern of fraud so extensive and deliberate that it would certainly qualify for federal prosecution under the RICO statutes. "Ladies and gentlemen," came Captain Morrison's voice over the intercom, though his tone was no longer the neutral professionalism of a commercial pilot, but something harder and more personal. "We are beginning our descent back to Teterboro Airport, where we will be met by federal investigators from the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and please understand that any attempt to interfere with the aircraft's operation or the ongoing federal investigation will result in additional charges of air piracy and terrorism." Richard's face had gone from pale to gray, the kind of unhealthy color that suggested his circulatory system was struggling to process the massive shift in his circumstances from celebrated executive to federal criminal defendant. "You can't do this," he said, his voice carrying the kind of desperate authority that men used when they felt their power slipping away but hadn't quite accepted the reality of their new situation. "I have lawyers. I have connections. I have a golden parachute contract that protects me from exactly this kind of corporate warfare. Richard. Diana said, her voice taking on the patient tone that someone might use to explain basic mathematics to a child who was struggling with the concept of numbers. You don't have a golden parachute for criminal activity. No contract in the world can protect you from federal prosecution for fraud, and no lawyer can make $12 million in stolen money disappear from the evidence files that are already being reviewed by federal prosecutors. She tapped the tablet screen again, and the monitors showed what appeared to be real-time bank records with account balances and transaction histories that painted a detailed picture of exactly how the money had flowed from Aurora Aviation through Meridian Consultants into personal accounts controlled by Richard and his co-conspirators. Your offshore accounts are being frozen as we speak. Your personal assets are being seized to cover restitution payments, and your professional reputation is being destroyed so thoroughly that you'll never work in corporate aviation again. Trevor made a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a sob, the kind of noise that someone made when they realized that their entire future had just been erased in the space of a conversation. I just did what Richard told me to do. I didn't know it was illegal. I thought it was just creative accounting, the kind of thing that everyone in corporate America does to maximize shareholder value. Trevor. Diana said, turning toward him with an expression that might have contained a microscopic amount of sympathy if he'd been looking closely enough to see it. Ignorance of securities law is not a legal defense, and following orders to commit federal crimes doesn't exempt you from prosecution. However, cooperation with federal investigators and full restitution of stolen funds can significantly reduce sentencing recommendations. The plane banked sharply as Captain Morrison began the approach to Teterboro, and through the windows Diana could see the New Jersey coastline spreading out below them like a map, with the airport visible in the distance as a collection of runways and hangars that would soon be crawling with federal agents and forensic accountants. The luxury cabin that had seemed so spacious and comfortable during takeoff now felt like a very expensive prison cell carrying three very frightened criminals toward a reckoning they'd never imagined possible when they'd been laughing about their cleverness just minutes earlier. The descent through the storm clouds was turbulent in more ways than meteorological, each air pocket and wind shear causing the Gulf Stream to shudder and buck in ways that seemed to mirror the emotional upheaval happening inside the cabin, where three Aurora Aviation executives were coming to terms with the fact that their careers, and quite possibly their freedom, were ending at the same rapid pace as their altitude. Diana remained standing near the galley, one hand braced against the polished wood trim for stability, her expression calm and composed, while she watched Richard Blackwood's face cycle through the 5 stages of grief in fast-forward motion. "This is impossible," Richard said for the third time, his voice taking on the kind of repetitive quality that suggested his mind was stuck in a loop, unable to process the magnitude of what was happening to him. "You can't just buy a company and immediately prosecute the management team for standard business practices. Corporate acquisitions don't work that way. There are protections and procedures and legal safeguards that prevent exactly this kind of hostile action." Diana's smile was the kind that sharks might wear if they were capable of expressing amusement, cold and sharp, and utterly without warmth or mercy. "Richard, nothing about stealing $12 million from your own company constitutes standard business practices, and nothing about federal crimes falls under the protection of corporate acquisition law. You seem to be laboring under the delusion that white-collar theft somehow carries different consequences than any other kind of stealing. But I assure you that federal prosecutors don't distinguish between someone who robs a bank with a gun and someone who robs a company with fraudulent invoices." Through the cabin windows, the lights of Teterboro Airport were becoming visible through the rain and clouds, a constellation of red and white navigation beacons that marked the boundary between their current liminal space and the very real consequences waiting on the ground. Diana could see emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, though she suspected they weren't there for aviation safety but rather for the kind of corporate emergency that required federal agents and forensic accountants rather than paramedics and fire trucks. Trevor was hunched over in his seat, his head in his hands making the kind of quiet, whimpering sounds that suggested he was finally beginning to understand the full scope of what he'd lost in the space of a single conversation. His house, his car, his savings account, his wife's respect, his children's college funds, probably even his ability to find employment in any industry that required background checks. All of it was disappearing as quickly as the altitude on the flight display. Diana Jennifer spoke for the first time since the revelation, her voice carrying a note of desperate hope that suggested she was still looking for some kind of escape route from the consequences of her complicity in the fraud. I want you to know that I never directly participated in the financial arrangements that Richard described. My role was limited to processing payroll and benefits administration. I had no knowledge of the offshore accounts or the false maintenance records. Diana turned toward Jennifer with the kind of focused attention that made seasoned corporate executives nervous, studying her face with the analytical precision of someone who had spent decades learning to read people's motivations and intentions through their micro-expressions and body language. Jennifer, your signature is on 18 months' worth of fraudulent consulting invoices authorizing payments to Meridian Consultants for services that were never provided. Your employee identification code was used to access maintenance records that were subsequently falsified to justify those payments. Your computer was used to send emails approving expenditures that you knew exceeded normal operational parameters. The HR director's face went pale as she realized that Diana wasn't just speaking from general knowledge about the fraud, but from detailed forensic analysis of the specific evidence that would be used to prosecute her. I was following direct orders from Richard. He told me that the consulting arrangements were approved by corporate leadership and that my job was to process the paperwork, not to question executive decisions about resource allocation. Jennifer, Diana said, her voice taking on the patient tone that professors used when explaining basic concepts to students who weren't quite grasping the material. Following orders to commit federal crimes is not a legal defense. It's evidence of conspiracy. However, full cooperation with the investigation, complete disclosure of all relevant information, and genuine remorse for your actions can significantly influence prosecutorial recommendations and sentencing guidelines. The plane's landing gear deployed with a series of mechanical sounds that were somehow both routine and ominous, the normal operational procedures of a $75 million aircraft carrying them inexorably toward consequences that none of them except Diana had anticipated when they'd taken off less than 2 hours earlier. The cabin pressure changed slightly as they descended through the final approach, and Diana could feel her ears popping in response to the atmospheric shift, a minor physical discomfort that seemed insignificant compared to the emotional and legal pressure that was building for the 3 people who would soon be exiting this aircraft in federal custody. I need you to understand something, Richard said suddenly, his voice taking on a different quality, harder and more dangerous than the defeated whimpering he'd been doing since Diana revealed herself. I am not some small-time corporate criminal that you can destroy with a phone call to your government friends. My family has connections that go back generations, connections to people who make policy decisions and judicial appointments and federal budget allocations. If you think you can prosecute me without considering the broader political implications of attacking someone with my level of social and economic influence, you are making a serious miscalculation that will damage your company more than it damages me. Diana's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted, a subtle hardening that suggested Richard had just crossed a line from which there would be no return to whatever minimal mercy she might have been considering. Richard, your family connections are exactly why this investigation will be conducted with exceptional thoroughness and transparency, because federal prosecutors are acutely aware that people will be watching to see whether the justice system applies different standards to different social classes. Your Ivy League credentials and your trust fund actually make you a more attractive target for prosecution, not a more protected one, because your conviction will send a message about equal justice under law that resonates far beyond the aerospace industry. The wheels touched the runway with a series of impacts that were somehow both gentle and final. the sophisticated landing systems of the Gulfstream absorbing most of the shock while still providing that unmistakable sensation of return to Earth that marked the end of their flight and the beginning of whatever came next. Through the windows, Diana could see a convoy of black SUVs parked near the hangar, along with what appeared to be a mobile command center and several vehicles that carried the distinctive markings of federal law enforcement agencies. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom one final time, though his tone was no longer the professional neutrality of commercial aviation, but something more personal and more satisfied. Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at Teterboro Airport, where the current ground temperature is 42 degrees, and the local time is 4:47 p.m. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop, and federal agents have boarded to escort passengers to the appropriate destinations. Miss Chen, thank you for allowing me to participate in what has been the most satisfying flight of my 30-year career. As the engines wound down and the cabin fell into an unusual quiet, Diana moved toward the main exit door, pausing to look back at the three people who would soon discover that criminal justice moved much faster than corporate politics, especially when the evidence was as comprehensive and damning as what Phoenix Holdings had collected during their brief flight above the storm clouds. Richard, Diana, said, her voice carrying the kind of finality that marked the end of negotiations and the beginning of consequences. You wanted me to wait outside like some kind of animal because you thought I was powerless to fight back. In approximately 5 minutes, you're going to learn what it feels like to wait in a place where you actually are powerless, where the people in charge don't care about your family connections or your Ivy League credentials or your trust fund, where you're just another number in an orange jumpsuit hoping someone will treat you with basic human dignity. The aircraft door opened with a mechanical hiss, and cold November air rushed into the cabin, carrying the smell of rain and jet fuel and the approaching end of everything Richard Blackwood thought he knew about power and privilege and consequences. The federal agents who boarded the Gulfstream moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke to years of conducting arrests in unusual circumstances, though Diana suspected that corporate fraud prosecutions at 37,000 feet were probably not covered in standard FBI training protocols. Special Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to Diana despite the shared surname, led the team with a combination of professional courtesy and implacable authority that made it clear that everyone on the aircraft would be following her directions whether they wanted to or not. Miss Chen, Agent Chen said, addressing Diana with the kind of respectful acknowledgement that one professional extended to another. Thank you for your cooperation with this investigation. The evidence you've provided has allowed us to coordinate with the Treasury Department and the Securities and Exchange Commission to freeze approximately $14 million in assets across 7 different offshore accounts, which represents a recovery rate that exceeds anything we've achieved in similar corporate fraud cases. Diana nodded her acknowledgement, while mentally noting that the federal investigators had uncovered even more stolen money than she'd initially calculated, suggesting that Richard's theft had been going on longer and been more extensive than even the detailed Phoenix Holdings analysis had revealed. Agent Chen, I assume you'll need detailed statements from all parties involved, and I want to make it clear that Phoenix Holdings will provide complete access to our forensic accounting analysis and full cooperation with any ongoing investigation. Richard Blackwood. Agent Chen said, turning toward the man who had been the absolute authority at Aurora Aviation just 2 hours earlier, but was now looking around the cabin like a trapped animal searching for an escape route that didn't exist. You are under arrest for wire fraud, securities, fraud conspiracy to defraud the federal government, and violations of federal aviation safety regulations. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest that you exercise that right until you've had an opportunity to consult with legal counsel. The handcuffs that Agent Chen applied to Richard's wrists were the standard issue restraints used by federal law enforcement, nothing dramatic or ceremonial, just practical steel that transformed someone from a free person into a federal prisoner with a simple clicking sound that seemed to echo through the cabin with unusual finality. Richard's face had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested his circulatory system was struggling to process the reality of his situation, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there during his earlier confident discussion of offshore banking and fraudulent maintenance records. "I want to call my lawyer Richard," said, though the authority he'd carried just hours earlier had been replaced by something that sounded more like pleading than commanding. "I want to call my family's attorney, and I want to contact my father immediately because this entire situation represents a serious misunderstanding of standard corporate practices that can be resolved through appropriate legal channels." Agent Chen's expression didn't change, but Diana caught a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she'd heard similar protests from dozens of other white-collar criminals who believed their family connections would somehow exempt them from federal prosecution. "Mr. Blackwood, you'll have access to legal counsel during the booking process, but I should inform you that your family's attorney has already been contacted and has declined to represent you in this matter, citing potential conflicts of interest with other clients who might be affected by your case." The impact of that information hit Richard like a physical blow, and Diana watched his face cycle through shock disbelief and finally a kind of hollow understanding that his family had made the calculated decision to protect their own interests rather than defend him against federal criminal charges. It was the kind of abandonment that people like Richard never expected because they'd spent their entire lives believing that their social position provided insulation from consequences, but Diana had seen it happen before in high-profile white-collar cases where family loyalty collided with criminal liability. Trevor Hartley accepted his arrest with the kind of broken resignation that suggested he'd already moved through the denial phase and into acceptance, though his cooperation with the federal agents was motivated more by terror than any genuine remorse for his actions. Agent Chen Trevor said as the handcuffs were applied to his wrists. "I want to cooperate fully with the investigation. I can provide detailed information about offshore banking procedures, falsified inspection reports, and other potential criminal activities that I observed during my employment at Aurora Aviation." "Mr. Hartley, Agent Chen," replied her voice carrying the neutral professionalism that federal prosecutors used when potential cooperating witnesses were offering testimony against their co-conspirators. "Those discussions will take place during formal debriefing sessions with federal prosecutors, and any cooperation agreement will need to be approved by the U.S. Attorney's Office after they've had an opportunity to evaluate the value and credibility of the information you're offering." Jennifer Walsh's arrest was perhaps the most painful to watch because, unlike Richard's arrogant shock or Trevor's calculating cooperation, her response was genuine remorse mixed with the kind of self-destruction that came from understanding that she'd betrayed her own professional ethics for the approval of people who had never actually respected her. "I knew it was wrong," Jennifer said as Agent Chen read her rights, her voice barely audible over the sound of rain against the aircraft windows. "I knew the invoices were fraudulent. I knew the maintenance reports were falsified, but I was afraid of losing my job. And I convinced myself that following orders was more important than following the law." Diana felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy for Jennifer because her situation was different from Richard's entitled criminality or Trevor's greedy opportunism. Jennifer had been caught in the classic corporate dilemma of choosing between personal ethics and professional survival, and she'd made the wrong choice repeatedly until the accumulation of small compromises had led to major criminal liability. Jennifer Diana said her voice softer than it had been during the confrontations with Richard and Trevor. Cooperation with federal investigators and genuine acceptance of responsibility can make a significant difference in how prosecutors approach your case. As the 3 Aurora executives were escorted off the aircraft in federal custody, Diana remained behind to coordinate with the forensic accountants who would be analyzing the company's financial records for additional evidence of fraud or safety violations. The hangar that had been the scene of her humiliation just hours earlier was now crawling with federal agents, computer specialists, and investigators who were methodically documenting every aspect of Aurora Aviation's operations for use in what would certainly become a landmark federal prosecution. Captain Morrison appeared in the cabin doorway, his expression showing a combination of professional satisfaction and personal vindication that made Diana think he'd probably been suspicious of Aurora's management practices for longer than she'd realized. Miss Chen Captain Morrison said, his voice carrying genuine warmth for the first time since she'd met him. "I want you to know that what you did today probably saved lives. The maintenance shortcuts that Mr. Blackwood was authorizing would have eventually resulted in aircraft failures that could have killed passengers, and your investigation has prevented that from happening." Diana looked out the cabin windows at the federal investigation unfolding around the hangar, watching as agents carefully cataloged evidence and interviewed employees who were finally free to tell the truth about the corporate culture they'd been forced to endure under Richard Blackwood's leadership. Captain Morrison Diana said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that justice was being served, not just for her own humiliation, but for every employee who had been intimidated into silence, and every passenger who had unknowingly risked their lives on aircraft maintained with fraudulent safety standards. No one should have to wait outside in the rain for basic human dignity, and no one should have to risk their lives because executives prioritize personal profit over passenger safety. The investigation would continue for months. The prosecutions would take years, and the corporate reforms would be ongoing, but the moment of accountability had arrived with the kind of swift justice that people like Richard Blackwood never expected, because they'd spent their entire lives believing that consequences were for other people. People who didn't have family connections and offshore bank accounts and the kind of social position that was supposed to provide insulation from the criminal justice system. Diana Chen had just proven that assumption wrong, and the reverberations would be felt throughout the aerospace industry for years to come. 6 months later, Diana stood in the renovated Phoenix Aviation headquarters, looking out through floor-to-ceiling windows at the same tarmac where Richard Blackwood had forced her to wait in the rain. But everything about the scene had been transformed in ways both visible and profound. The hangar bore new signage in Phoenix Holdings' distinctive blue and silver, and the aircraft inside gleamed under upgraded LED lighting that made the entire space feel more welcoming and professional than the cold, intimidating environment she remembered from that November afternoon. The federal prosecutions had proceeded with the kind of methodical thoroughness that made headlines and set precedents, with Richard Blackwood ultimately receiving a 12-year sentence in federal prison, where his Ivy League credentials and family connections carried exactly as much weight as Diana had predicted they would, which was none whatsoever. The news reports from the Federal Correctional Facility indicated that he was currently working in the kitchen detail, earning 12 cents an hour washing dishes, and learning about the kind of work he'd spent his entire career looking down on. Though Diana suspected the irony was lost on someone who still believed his incarceration was the result of prosecutorial overreach, rather than personal accountability for criminal behavior. Trevor Hartley's cooperation with federal investigators had earned him a reduced sentence and early release to a halfway house, but his career in corporate sales was permanently finished, and the last Diana had heard, he was working as a compliance officer for a small regional airline, using his intimate knowledge of fraud schemes to help prevent exactly the kind of criminal behavior he'd once participated in. It was the kind of redemption arc that suggested genuine remorse and personal growth, though Diana suspected his motivation was more practical than philosophical, based on understanding that cooperation with law enforcement was his only path back to anything resembling professional respectability. Jennifer Walsh had perhaps traveled the most interesting journey from criminal defendant to productive citizen, accepting full responsibility for her actions and using her experience to develop corporate ethics training programs that were now being implemented throughout the aerospace industry. She'd served 6 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of probation, but rather than trying to return to her previous career, she'd chosen to become an advocate for employees facing ethical dilemmas in corporate environments, helping people navigate the kind of impossible choices between professional survival and personal integrity that had led to her own downfall. The transformation of Aurora Aviation into Phoenix Aviation had become a case study in corporate cultural change, with business schools and industry organizations studying Diana's methodology for identifying and eliminating institutional corruption while maintaining operational efficiency and employee morale. The company's safety ratings had improved dramatically once genuine maintenance standards were implemented, and federal aviation authorities had held up Phoenix Aviation as a model for how private aviation companies should balance profitability with passenger safety and worker dignity. Diana's approach to corporate leadership had attracted attention far beyond the aerospace industry, with other CEOs requesting consultation on how to conduct similar internal investigations and cultural overhauls in their own organizations. The concept of executive accountability and employee empowerment that she'd demonstrated during the Aurora acquisition had inspired changes in corporate governance practices throughout multiple industries, proving that her experience in that Gulfstream cabin had implications that extended far beyond a single case of white-collar crime. But the most meaningful changes were often the smallest ones, the day-to-day operational details that reflected a fundamental shift in how Phoenix Aviation treated its employees and customers. The executive bathroom that Richard Blackwood had used to intimidate visitors was now a lactation room for nursing mothers among the staff. The luxury conference room where he'd conducted his fraudulent business was now a break room for mechanics and support personnel. And the hangar office where he'd once held court over his criminal empire was now a training center where employees learned about safety protocols, ethics, standards, and their rights under federal whistleblower protection statutes. Carlos Rodriguez, the junior mechanic who had wanted to help Diana during her time waiting in the rain but had been too afraid of Richard's retaliation, was now the lead maintenance supervisor and had become something of a legend among Phoenix Aviation employees for his technical expertise and his commitment to the kind of safety standards that protected both workers and passengers. His transformation from frightened employee to confident leader reflected the broader cultural changes that Diana had implemented throughout the company, creating an environment where competence and character mattered more than political connections or social climbing. As Diana prepared to board the same Gulfstream G700 that had been the scene of Richard Blackwood's confession and arrest, she noticed Carlos approaching across the tarmac carrying a large black umbrella, though the sky was clear and there was no immediate threat of precipitation. When he reached her position near the aircraft stairs, he held the umbrella above her head with the kind of courteous professionalism that spoke to genuine respect rather than subservient fear, and Diana understood that this gesture represented something much more significant than weather protection. Miss Chen, Carlos said, his voice carrying the confidence that came from working in an environment where technical expertise was valued and employee input was encouraged rather than punished. Company policy now requires that all executives be provided with appropriate weather protection during aircraft boarding procedures, regardless of current atmospheric conditions. It's part of our commitment to treating all personnel with dignity and respect. Diana accepted the umbrella's protection with a smile that carried genuine warmth rather than the cold satisfaction she'd felt during Richard's arrest, understanding that true leadership wasn't about punishing people who had wronged you, but about creating systems that prevented future wrongs while empowering people to achieve their full potential. She walked up the aircraft stairs with Carlos beside her, not because protocol required his presence, but because she'd learned that the most important business decisions were often made in collaboration with people who understood the practical realities of implementation, rather than just the theoretical possibilities of corporate strategy. As the Gulfstream lifted off into clear November skies, Diana looked down at the Phoenix Aviation facility where employees were beginning their shifts with the kind of purpose and professional pride that came from working for an organization that valued their contributions and protected their dignity. The storm clouds that had dominated the weather 6 months earlier had given way to sunshine that turned the landscape below into a patchwork of possibilities. And Diana understood that some storms were meant to be weathered, while others were meant to provide the wind that carried you higher than you'd ever imagined possible. The photograph of her grandmother that Diana still carried in her coat pocket seemed to smile up at her from its worn edges, and she could almost hear the old woman's voice reminding her that dignity wasn't something you begged for or demanded or stole from others, but something you created through excellence and shared through generosity and protected through the kind of quiet strength that built companies and changed industries and proved that power was most effective when it lifted others rather than crushing them. Phoenix Aviation's transformation methodology became the industry standard for corporate cultural reform, with Diana's approach being adopted by Fortune 500 companies across multiple sectors. The federal legislation inspired by the case strengthened whistleblower protections and mandatory reporting requirements for corporate safety violations, creating lasting systemic changes that protected both employees and consumers. Most importantly, the principle that dignity should be company policy rather than personal privilege became embedded in Phoenix Holdings' corporate culture, proving that businesses could be both profitable and humane when leadership understood that true power came from elevating others rather than diminishing them. Diana kept Carlos's umbrella in her office as a reminder that respect like weather protection should be offered freely rather than earned through suffering, and that the strongest companies were built by leaders who understood that everyone deserved shelter from the storm. If this story of corporate accountability and personal transformation moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content about justice, dignity, and the power of standing up for what's right. Have you ever been underestimated or mistreated by someone in authority? Share your story in the comments below and let us know how you handled the situation. Together, we can build a world where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve, regardless of their position or background.